All right, we are live. We are thankful for your presence. We are thankful for those who have joined us by way of internet, whether you're joining us live or you're joining us sometime in the future. We are thankful for you being a part of this study today. We do ask that if you have any questions about anything you hear, that you reach out to us and allow us to answer your questions. No one should have a question that goes unanswered, and your questions are important. We've been in the book of Matthew. We started out in chapter 1 and went through the introductory material, and went through the first 17 verses, what was important out of which all of it is important. Some things are more important. We tried to cover the high spots of the genealogy. And then last week we went through the announcement of the birth of Jesus, but we didn't really cover it all that I wanted to. And so I want to just kind of try to put a bow on some things today before we get into chapter 2. And we talked last week about how this was an announcement in the midst of a betrothal, a binding, committed. They were called husband and wife, and Mary was a virgin. They weren't consummating that union yet, and she winds up pregnant. And we talked about the difficulties of that and all of that messy stuff. And I want to kind of bring out the fact that when that happened, you think Jesus might have been an unwanted baby at first? I mean, when Joseph gets the news before he hears from the angel, do you think he was really excited about the fact that his to-be wife was pregnant? He probably his initial thoughts were, I don't want this. And I don't know if abortion was available back then. Probably was. But what might some people today counsel her back then to do? Keep it a secret? Get rid of it? And how would that have affected us? It would have been terrible. But it's terrible that that kind of thing is still happening today. And there's no telling all the kinds of different blessings, the people, the babies that have been murdered, and how they could have blessed our society and our lives. And so this unwanted baby thing is something that we could elucidate on for quite a while, but it was true. Jesus wasn't wanted. Herod didn't want him. Herod did not want Jesus. What did Herod try to do to him? Tried to kill him. Herod didn't want Jesus. We see that, when Jesus grew up, his own people didn't want him. John said he came into his own, and his own what? Received him not. They didn't want him. His own brethren, his blood family did not believe him or even want him. They were probably ashamed of him until after the resurrection. They had to literally see him be crucified and then come back to life before they was able to accept him for who he is and was, the Savior of the world, the Son of God. But they didn't want him. The Jewish religious establishment didn't want him. They were the ones that were constantly after him to kill him, weren't they? Because why? Because he challenged them. He put the test to them. Every time they came, he just flipped it on them and sat the box in front of their feet and said, now deal with that. And they hated him for it. But the virgin birth is important for us to wrap our mind around. And it's important for us to accept because it was a divine act. The virgin birth proves so much to us, and it's important for us to accept. The virgin birth was the fulfillment of prophecy. It had been spoken of by Isaiah, and it was prophesied 700 to 750 years before it happened. The virgin birth is important. The virgin birth accounts for the pre-existence of Christ. because he was without human father. And so he was that which was from old. And so it accounts for his pre-existence, the eternality of Christ. The virgin birth explains how he can be fully God and fully man. It's important. That's why we have this account. But I think most important of all is that the virgin birth complements the resurrection. They're both equally important. Jesus came into this world miraculously, and he left it miraculously too. That's important, isn't it? Jesus, the Son of God, came into this world in a miraculous way, and he left it in a miraculous way. He was raised from the dead, went about 40 days or so, and then he left it in a miraculous way. That is our Savior. There's a lot of things that we could speculate about Joseph. We do think that Joseph was already past when all of these terrible things happened to Jesus, because after this, he's really not mentioned after Jesus' boyhood. He's not. He just goes away from the scriptures, which tells us that he probably did not live to see the crucifixion of Jesus. But many want the baby, don't they? The baby Jesus. Those under the umbrella of Christendom. We've talked about the unwanted baby. But there's a lot of people that want the baby Jesus. They want the little child in a manger, but not everybody wants the grown man.
That's all they want. Baby.
Yeah. But it's important for us to, go ahead.
Well, on that thought, I think you can see it no more clearly, and everybody's seen this, of Santa Claus in his full outfit, red suit, kneeling down at the manger. We want Santa Claus, we want gifts, we want parties, and the baby Jesus fits in with that. As the adult, he has some hard things to say to us.
Yeah. We considered a pretty difficult story this morning that Jesus taught. And so a lot of people want the manger, but they're not so into that empty tomb. That empty tomb that demands his lordship over us, his kingship over us. But it's important that both places are empty. The manger is empty and the tomb is empty. And they've been empty for a long time. And that is of utmost importance to us. While Jesus may not be wanted by everyone in the world, he's desperately needed. Jesus is desperately needed. And so we're going to get into chapter number 2. And this story continues whenever we think of the world as using this as our Christmas story, right? And when we consider, and we talked about this in December last year, when we consider this text that is used as the Christmas story, we see how off base a lot of times the Christmas story has been. And so it's going to be interesting for us to look at this and to consider what is said. In chapter 2 and verse number 1, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and notice this, and all of Jerusalem with him. That's important. There's some really important stuff right here in the first 3 verses. And it's really packed full. Now, he was born in Bethlehem of Judea. This is the ancestral home of King David. That's important for us to get. He was the founder of that royal dynasty. After Saul had been rejected, the Lord said, I've found a man after my own heart. I'm going to establish his throne forever. Jesus is, as we noticed, the legal right and a blood kin to this throne. And so he's born in this place, and it was prophesied that that the Savior, the Christ, would come from this place. And it's interesting to see that when Herod heard these things, he was troubled. Now, here we have the infant Jesus. And he has already shaken to the core this king, Herod. This infant has come into the world, and just because he is an infant, we see he has infinite power from the very beginning. The infant had infinite power from the beginning. Go ahead. No, this would have been the text said his star. This would have been a phenomenon. This would have been something extremely special. You know, there was a pillar of cloud and fire that led Israel. God has been able to use phenomenon in the past to lead people, and that's what happens here. This star is called his star. Now this term wise men, the term is magi. And what they were astronomers. They were astronomers and philosophers. And so these people, they're all about the stars and astrology and things like that. And so they see, and the text calls it his star. That's important. This was the star of Christ. This was his star. It was it was something that they saw this and said, wow, we've not seen this star before. This is, it wasn't anything to track. It led them. Yeah, that star led them. And so it's interesting as we get into it, we'll see the Jews see his star in the east, and they come to worship him. But when Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled. Now this is Herod the Great. And he was not Jewish. He was an Edomite. But he was very successful in his reign as a king. He was very successful. He was actually able to survive and to keep ruling through several Roman emperors. As they would pass, he was able to win the hearts over again and to stay in power for a long time. He was a very corrupt politician king. He sure did. He did. It's interesting to note that one historian said that it was better and safer to be one of Herod's pigs than it was to be his son. He was known to be a brutal. When he came into power, he massacred much of the Sanhedrin. When he came into power, he murdered over 300 political figures. I mean, just wiped them out. Killed his wife, killed multiple sons, Antipater, several names. I'm not going to be able to recall them right now, but at least 4. And so he was ruthless. He was absolutely ruthless. But here, this little baby troubles him. Anything that rivaled his throne was good as dead. And so he's going to play this part, but he was hated by the Jews because he was an Edomite and he was so rough and tough and ruthless. But they also respected and revered his ability. I mean, what he did to the second temple, phenomenal. his additions, his architectural ability, what he did with the famine, his ability to help feed the people and to curb the tragedy of the famine. Phenomenal. So it was kind of a love-hate thing with him. He was a great administrator. Strong but evil. He had some mental problems, and they really showed up. And the older that he got, it got worse and worse. He was wealthy, politically gifted. He was intensely loyal to Rome, and that's why when another emperor would come up, why turn from him? He really laid a heavy burden on the Jews, and they hated him for that. But then they saw all that he built, and look what he did to the temple. And what did the Jews worship? The temple. I mean, the temple was their place, right? That was the most important landmark of all of Jerusalem. And so there was an interesting relationship there. But he was also known as a person full of rage and full of jealousy. It says that wise men from the east came to see Jesus. There's an interesting, how do we historically view this as taking place? There are how many?
We always historically say there's 3 because we kind of associate the gifts with that.
Right. Right. And so there were 3 gifts that were brought, and so these 3 kings, and they're called kings in the songs. It's so weird how, we kind of conflate and mess up with some old. Right? There's a lot of things. Right? So there's a lot of things that we could, and there's a lot of things. There's a lot of, there's Jerusalem is the city of 7 hills. It's all a hill when you're talking about Jerusalem, and yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Isn't it interesting? Now, in Luke's account, what happens? What do the shepherds do? They come and they see Joseph and Mary and the child, the baby, infant Jesus. And the wise men, these. Right. And so that tells us that this was a caravan. There was enough of these people to get the interest of King Herod. And so they probably had to get this trip planned up and had to have provisions for this journey. And it was enough of them to where the king took notice. And so that's important for us to kind of grasp as we talk about this, these wise men who have come to see. And the caravan was of such that the king was troubled. This isn't just 3 little old men that come and say, this is a crowd. This is a crowd. Yeah. And so it was enough of a caravan that the king heard about it. Herod heard these things, right? And so he was troubled. And it says all Jerusalem was troubled. Why was Jerusalem troubled?
Because they understood that it was a challenge to his power and that he was ruthless.
How is this guy going to react? There is no telling what he is going to do, because he's like got a hair trigger, right? And so this is troubling. The people of Jerusalem now are troubled. In verse 4, when he had gathered all of the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. Now, don't you think that he should know? This also lends credit to him not being a Jew, him being an Edomite, a political figure, because a Jew would know the prophecies. And so he calls these wise men and says, where is Christ going to be born? And they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, this is Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, and thou Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Isn't this interesting? In verse 2, he says, where is he that is born King of the Jews? How many are born a king? Are not men born princes and in some time become kings? Sure. I mean, we have biblical records of young men becoming co-regents and co-ruling and being trained as a co-ruler and trained in what it is to be a king with their father until their father passes, and then they have all the authority. But for maybe 20 years or more, they reign as a co-regent with their father. They're being brought up. But this child is born King of the Jews. His power and his governance was not conferred on him at some time later. As soon as he came into the world, he's king. It's interesting that when we get into the text and Jesus is mentioned before Mary, the child, and Luke 2 is mentioned before his mother, and that historically and within how they did things in Israel was not how that was done. The mother would have been named before the child, but not with Jesus. Jesus is named first. Colossians 1:18, that he should have preeminence in how many things? In all things. He was king as soon as he came out of the womb. And so he reveals what the prophet said. And then Herod, when he had privately, privily, in secret, called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. How nice. You know. Yeah. So, and we see the wisdom in these guys that they're not going to do that. I think that they anticipated something about the demeanor of this Herod. Maybe his reputation preceded him, and from wherever they were from, already knew a little about this Herod the Great and how he operated. But he secretly calls these wise men and inquires of them diligently what time the star appeared. Isn't it interesting that Herod knew who this was? He knew that this was the Christ child that was promised by the prophets. He knew that. And then he inquires for information to confirm when and where he was born. And was he doing that so he could obey the truth? No, he was not. He was inquiring of this information for evil purposes. Yeah. And doesn't this reveal the blackness of the heart of Herod as what he decides to do with this information? And so he sends them and says, you go search diligently. And when you have found him, bring word to me again, that I can come and worship him also. And when, verse 9, they had heard the king, they departed. The text does not give us any inclination that they agreed, that they said a word. They heard what he said, and when they heard, they departed. And so it doesn't tell us that they're like, yeah, we'll do that, and sure, we'll go find him, and we'll come right back and tell you. And it just says that they heard what he said. I think that they took to heart what he said. I think that they were wise enough to realize the intentions, and they took that to heart. Now, they genuinely wanted to find the Christ for a purpose. And I think that they had enough intuition to know that Herod wanted to find the Christ for a purpose too, and that he was a liar when he said, I want to worship him as well. And so they heard the king departed, and lo, listen to now, the star which they saw in the east went before them. This star is leading them till it came and stood over where the young child was. So after they leave the presence of this king, his star, that star, went before them and literally led them and stood over the place.
You mentioned astronomers. One reason I have a little trouble with that is people try to explain that away, that, well, at that time, if you look at it, there was this planet and that planet and this star, and that lined up to look like one real bright star. We're talking about things light years away.
Yeah.
And how does that come and stand over the place?
Yeah.
You know, it was something other than,
It was a beacon.
something that looked like,
There's a really good show in the planetarium at the Creation Museum in Kentucky, and it was really good. They scientifically went and ruled out a comet, a alignment of the planets, and said why. And they used science to explain, and they said it had to have been placed by God, and it gave all the reasons why it couldn't be, a comet going through or this or that. Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So, because I always kind of thought, it was a comet that was there and it was bright, but they ruled all that out and said it was definitely placed by God.
Yeah.
There.
So the God that can make a rushing river stop and be dry for the Israelites to go across, can he not make a star that rises up and is brighter than anything else,
and then sits right over Jerusalem.
and then
Or he cut them.
leads these men to where he wants them to go?
Absolutely.
Not unlike the pillar of fire by night, I mean, not that it was a pillar, but it was a bright spot.
Yeah.
It didn't stop time. The world was still revolving. The sun was still going up and down.
Yeah.
And so he made that star constantly in one place.
Yeah, it was his star.
Satellite,
Yeah.
geosynchronous satellite made it bright, and it was the beacon that they went to.
So if they were astronomers, maybe they said, this ain't a star.
Right. Well, whatever it was, it definitely intrigued them, didn't it? I mean, they knew that this is special and this is what is going to get us to where we're needing to go. They knew this was an act of God.
My point about travel, how far east? You don't have to go very far east till there's nothing. They had to come from at least Baghdad area.
It was a trip. That's why we suspect that this was probably at least a year and a half or so when they finally reach. I mean, there is some time that has elapsed, and that's why it took them a while to get the provisions up. It wasn't just the 2 or 3 of them. There was a crowd. There was a group of them. But talking about God's ability, this is the God that spoke all of this world into existence from nothing. It's interesting to think about humanity. Humanity is the only creation that rebels against God. We're it. God could speak to the furthest star, an inanimate object, and it would obey his voice immediately. But yet we as human beings, rebel against him. We're the only created beings that choose to do that. Psalm 33 and verse 6 says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and the host of them, that's the sun, moon, and stars, by the breath of his mouth. Verse 9 says that he spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood firm. That's all God had to do for his star. The star to lead them, whatever it was, whatever astrological or whatever phenomenon that led these men, all God had to do was speak it into existence, and it did. And it's interesting that it says that it came and it stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced. And they were with exceeding great joy. You talk about laying it on thick. How happy were these men? Exceeding great joy. What is so joyous about this incident? About them being a part of this very happening. Yeah. And not only does it happen in their lifetime, but they're a part of it. They are literally seeing this happen. They are following this phenomenon of God to the Messiah, the one that has been promised. Oh, see, these wise men, even though they were from a ways away, they were definitely of Jewish descent. Had the nation of Israel before this ever been scattered across the earth?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Matthew's the only one that talks about it.
Yeah. I don't have my hearing aids in today, so I'm struggling making sure. They're in the car. I forgot to.
And then first scattering, they call that person, they call it the diaspora.
Yeah. Yeah, the dispersion. So there were Jews all over the world. And if you have a comment, raise your hand, because I am literally deaf. But so that's why I'm kind of taking extra care to look around. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I'll do better next week. Or I'll try. And so they saw the star. They rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house. Is this the stable where the little manger is? They're not there anymore. We've got a young child who is in a house, and they saw the young child with Mary his mother and fell down and worshiped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This is fit for a king. A lot of times kings were given gifts of gold. I mean, what else are you going to give the king, right? Gold. Frankincense and myrrh, these are important things in this time. And so they're giving this young king gifts and treasures, right? They opened their treasures, present unto him. And in verse 12, and being warned of God in a dream. Now this is interesting. Being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed in their own country another way. So they may have had some intuition about Herod, but they were told specifically. God warned them and told them, better not go back. You go back another way, and you do not go back to Herod. And so who did they listen to? God or man? The king told them, you come back to me and report. We ought to obey God rather than man, shouldn't we? God warned them in a dream. God has used dreams several times throughout the scriptures to present information to mankind, and this is no different. God warns them, and they go to their own country another way. Man, this was hard for us to do. I mean, it was hard enough coming the way we did, and now we've got to go a totally different way. Oh, whatever you desire, Lord, that's my will.
Well, yeah, they probably knew that was real, because all of them probably had your same dream. They woke up, it's like, well, you know what I dreamed? Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't take them long to confer with one another and decide that that dream was legit. I doubt that they had very much question, if what they heard was from God or not. God is a clear communicator, isn't he? I'm not a clear communicator, but God is. And a lot of times men attack God's ability to communicate to men, and they say, well, we can't understand this. You might as well not try. Yeah, but God clearly communicates to men, whether it was in a dream or a vision. How did God communicate with Peter in that vision? It's pretty clear, his message, wasn't it? Do not call unclean what I have cleansed. However God has chosen to communicate, clear as a bell. This dream was clear as a bell. We're out of time. We'll pick up in verse number 12 next week. Thank you so much for your attention, and God bless you.